About 40 years ago, my wife worked for Broadman Press. She served as an editor for Broadman Press, and she edited a book called This Call We Share. And they said they needed something for the cover. So they asked my wife, Sandra, if she would serve on the cover. And she said, I will if Tom will. And so, believe it or not, that picture is 40 years old. I love the lapels and the long hair. In fact, these days, I love any hair. But that's Sandra and me, and that's the church that I pastored after seminary in the background. And, starting out in ministry 40 years ago, actually more than that, because I'd already pastored before I went to seminary, that was an exciting time. But pretty quickly along the way, I noticed something. I noticed that a lot of folks started out in ministry, but I was beginning to hear stories as I talked to fellow pastors, and they were sharing with me some of the difficulty that they had in ministry. And what I learned was this: within 5 years of starting in the ministry, 50% of them have stopped. 5 out of 10. And by the time you get to age 65, which was the old retirement age, 9 out of 10 were no longer serving in the ministry. Well, that concerned me. And so as I was studying and continuing to do graduate work, I really wanted to focus on what it was going to take for me to minister for a lifetime. I didn't want to be one of the statistics. I didn't want to be one of those that dropped out. I wanted to be faithful to the calling that God had given me. So I spent a lot of time studying and researching and did my doctoral work in the area of understanding and managing stress in the ministry. It was, for me, a fascinating study because it combined medicine, psychology, and theology. In fact, coming through Southwestern at the time, trying to do a doctorate like this, it kept pushing the limits of what they expected because it wasn't the classical, traditional way of studying things, that I really had to work in order to get it done, but I was fortunate in order to be able to do that. And so I studied understanding and managing stress in the ministry because I wanted to know how to minister for a lifetime. And I basically came up with a way of managing things that has served me for over 40 years. And it's really pretty simple. It begins with understanding stress, just what it is. And then being a good steward of the body that God has given me. And then finally, developing specific strategies along the way that I can incorporate in the way I managed people, managed myself, managed situations, and provided leadership. In fact, before I came here, I was in the Augusta, Georgia area, and some folks found out about it, and so we kind of took it live, and I had about 100 pastors in the Georgia area come over and participate, and we basically worked through personalized stress management strategies. When I first came to Houston, did a similar kind of thing. And this has served me well, and so I really thought I would take a moment to kind of share it with you, because several things have come to my attention. Dr. John Bassanio wrote a book, Wisdom for Life, and he calls it Keys to Finishing Well. Jimmy Draper came out not too long ago with a book, Don't Quit Before You Finish. Just a lot of good practical advice from seasoned veterans about what it means to minister for a lifetime or to lead for a lifetime. Well, what I discovered was stress is a natural and normal part of life. In fact, the only people that don't experience stress are 6 feet under. The rest of us experience stress on a daily basis. And there are some stressors that we commonly share. It doesn't matter who you are. In Houston, you still have to drive through traffic. You still have to pay bills. Occasionally you get sick. You get the irritating phone call. You get the salesman that calls right at dinner time. You have good things that happen to you. You know, Christmas comes, Thanksgiving comes, vacation comes. But have you ever noticed, for all the good that it is, what it's like to come back off of vacation for a couple of weeks, and then suddenly you have to hit the ground running and work even harder than you did? And sometimes you say, you know, it really wasn't worth it to take the vacation. Even good things can be stressful for us. And the ministry has its own set of stressors. I found this quote from a Methodist pastor. He said, "The modern preacher has to make as many visits as a country doctor, shake as many hands as a politician, prepare as many briefs as a lawyer, see as many people as a specialist. He has to be as good an executive as the president of a university, as good a financier as a bank president, and in the midst of it all, he has to be so good a diplomat that he could umpire a baseball game between the Knights of Columbus and the Ku Klux Klan." Well, that may be overstating it just a bit, but, you know, not really. What I remember from my days as a pastor was that Sunday came 7 days a week. It's like I was always getting ready for Sunday. And I did it in the old days. I didn't, you know, today a lot of pastors talk to me, and I talked to one pastor the other day. He said, "Yeah, Tom," he said, "I preach in my church 45 times a year." Because he only does services on Sunday, or on the weekend, one service, same service repeated multiple times. But he said, you know, 45 times. And Bob Overton is here, and he remembers the days when we used to preach on Wednesday night and Sunday morning and Sunday night, and then lead a Bible study. And there was a whole lot of preparation. It was like Sunday was always coming. I love the cartoon from Leadership Journal. A pastor is sitting on the couch with his wife. They're looking at the calendar. And she said, "God loves you, and everybody else has a wonderful plan for your life." and you know, it's that way. The meetings we attend, the pressure of leadership, being on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the call in the middle of the night, the cantankerous member. You know, there are a lot of stresses that come along that are unique to our role as ministry. It's not that others don't have similar kinds of things, but kind of the combination is special for us. Well, somehow we've got to figure out a way to manage the stressors in our life. And I compare it a lot to weightlifting. And here's what I discovered. That all of us have a personal stress threshold. We have an amount of stress that either psychologically, biologically, or spiritually we are able to handle. And it's not the same for everybody. We have our unique, individualized stress threshold. And as we go through the day, as we go through the year, things happen to us. And for the most part, these things are manageable. But the thing I didn't know is that these are cumulative. It's not just that they happen to us, but they build upon one another. And then it's just like lifting weights. You know, eventually they keep putting enough weight on there that suddenly you strain to hold it up. But then the moment comes and they put on that extra 5 pounds or the extra 10 pounds, and suddenly you can't handle it anymore. We call that crossing the stress threshold. And that's when the negative effects of stress really begin to affect us. Doctors are telling us that much of the illness that we experience is stress-related. That's because it wears down the system, it inhibits our ability to fight off disease and to deal with other things, and it always attacks the weakest link in the body. So whatever you are biologically predisposed to, that's where it will show up first. So for some people, it's gastrointestinally. For others, it's blood pressure and the cardiovascular system. For others, it creates a sense of sleeplessness and fatigue and depression. it will show up in some way that you are biologically predisposed to. And then we begin to have the cumulative negative effects of stress. Is that one of the ways to manage that? And really, it's kind of like lifting weight. You either have to build up your muscle so you can hold more weight, or you got to take weight off the dumbbell so that it's at a manageable level. And the same thing's true with stress. We either have to reduce the stressors in our life, or we have to generate additional capacity to manage more stress. Those are our only options. And so I spent a lot of time in my research and study trying to figure out how to do those two things. How to reduce the stressors and how to increase my capacity to manage stress. And one of the things that I discovered was we have to be better stewards of our own bodies. You know, the Bible says, don't you know your bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you've received from God? You're not your own, you're bought with a price. Therefore, honor God with your body. And a lot of times we don't think of taking good care of ourselves as a stewardship of the resource that God has given to us. And what I discovered was we already know what we need to do. There is no secret sauce. There is no special ingredient. We already know what we have to do. And I bet if I ask you, you could name the three things without me even having to tell you what they were. But the first is, we have to eat right. We are what we eat. And you know, you can go to 100 websites, I'm sure, and they'll give you good nutritional guidelines. It's things like, you know, eat more green leafy vegetables and, you know, avoid trans fats and, you know, it's all those kinds of, and, you know, eat from all of the main food groups, you know, and that's not pizza and cake and, you know, we need to eat better. Unfortunately, the world in which we live doesn't encourage that. You know, how many times are we stopping by at a fast food restaurant and eating as we drive through town? You know, we do it. And fast food is some of the worst in terms of the effect and the impact it has on the body. And yet, I really think this is a good biblical stewardship. We need to take care of ourselves, and we need to take care of what we eat and watch what we eat. I'm also doing some research and have for the last 4 or 5 years in neuropsychology. I have a clinical psych background, and so for fun, I study stuff like that. And what I discovered was that the brain functions best at reduced caloric intake. That means, well, you know what that means. Have you ever eaten heavily and then tried to be alert and think? You know, we actually function better when we eat fewer calories. Now, they've done studies with animals, and they say with a 50% reduced caloric intake, they have a 35% increased brain efficiency. Now, I'm not going to eat 50% less calories in order to have a 35% increased brain efficiency, and you aren't either. But what it's saying is that what we eat does influence even our ability to make decisions, to remember, to process information. And so we need to be careful with what we eat. So watch that. Take vitamin supplements. Now, if I start out with watch what you eat, we probably don't have to think too hard. You know, get good exercise. Interestingly, in the research that I'm doing in neuropsychology, it's also saying that the brain functions best when we exercise regularly every week. So if you have a pattern of habitually exercising 30 to 60 minutes vigorously 3 times a week, then you are going to function better. You're taking better care of your body. And watching what you eat and exercising regularly is going to also make it easier for you to think. And believe it or not, even things like praying and preparing, those things come better when we not only eat well, but when we exercise well. Is somebody a real good math person? Here's what I want you to multiply. 70 times 60. All right, times 24. Well, it's over 100,000, right? All right, so now, since you had that handy, let's just do 80 times 60 times 24.
115,200.
Yeah, 115,200. You know what that is? That's about how many times your heart beats per day. The average heartbeat for, most of us is going to be between, let's say 60 to 100. An acceptable resting heart rate is going to be about 72. But when you're standing up here doing stuff like this, I'm just curious right now. Yeah, my heart rate was 89 10 minutes ago. So right now it's going to be, somewhere in that category. That means my heart is beating, if it stayed at this rate, about 125,000 times per day. That's why exercise is so important. So the aerobic exercise, which builds up your cardiovascular system, and then the regular habitual exercise is so important because that's what keeps this beating. And it's also what keeps our brain functioning better. The third thing is get plenty of rest. I read a book a number of years ago called The Power of Full Engagement. And it wasn't about increasing your energy. It was about using the energy level that you have to the max. And one of the things that was emphasized was not only do we need between 7 and 8 hours of sleep per night, that's a rough average, some of you more, some a little less. But we need to do it in a habitual and repeated pattern, which means we need to go to sleep at the same time every night and get up at the same time every morning as much as possible to establish that pattern, because that's when the body is functioning at its best. Now, we're not always able to do that in our widely traveled time zone inclusive world, and there's a lot of complications. But it's one of the things that's really important to us if we want to function well. And, for those who have difficulty sleeping at night, one of the key things you need to do, turn off the TV at least an hour before you want to go to bed. Because the blue light emanating from the screen, whether it's your phone or your tablet or the TV, is helping to keep you awake and will make it harder for you to fall asleep at night. So just simple things like establishing a pattern, turning off the TV, to read or whatever you might want to do before will help you sleep better. And maintaining that routine means that you are going to be a better steward of your body. Interestingly, in the stuff in neuropsychology, same thing. Eat right, exercise regularly, and sleep well will make your brain function at its peak performance. Simple. And yet, it's not something that we practice because we take it for granted. And it's so easy to supplement today with a doctor. So, you got high cholesterol? Don't change your diet, just go to the doctor and get a pill. We have substituted common sense for pharmacology, and that's not best in the long run. So, function the way God created you to function at your best. And with that, what I discovered was, if you do all three of those, you're maxing out. If you do 2 out of the 3 and make adjustments in 2 out of the 3, you'll show improvement and you'll be better able to manage stress. Well, I did my doctoral work and I studied this and studied this. I talked with a lot of folks. In fact, I was studying this at a time 40 years ago where stress was just really being introduced as a viable topic. Hans Selye was the medical doctor that really began to call our attention to it, but there wasn't a lot of research done. But I read everything that I could find. And then I put it aside for a number of years. One day I started reading through the Gospels and said, all right, I want to read through all the Gospels this month. And as I did, I began to notice some things. I got through with that and said, I want to do that again. I want to do that again. And I found myself repeatedly reading through the Gospels and having, not doing this as a research project, but just beginning to identify some things. I noticed that Jesus incorporated a number of strategies for managing stress. I'm not going to say Jesus is a stress management expert and we need to study him if we want to learn good stress management. I'm just saying I took what I learned and I saw a lot in the life of Jesus that illustrated this. And we're not going to take time to go through these strategies. If anybody's interested, we can set up something else. We can go through these. I wrote a lot that dealt with this, not something we've dealt with here, but there's a lot that Jesus used in terms of his own strategies for managing stress. And it's a really, really fascinating study. And obviously, I incorporated it and applied it to the life of the minister. But moving beyond that, Lifeway, a couple of years ago, did some research, and they became concerned about the question, why is it that 9 out of 10 who start in the ministry will not retire in the ministry? And so they asked the question of a large body of folks, and you can read the particulars of the research online, but they asked the question of those who left the pastorate before age 65, why? Why did you leave the pastorate? And what they discovered was 5 primary responses. Change in calling, conflict in the church, burnout, financial issues, and family issues. Well, as I thought about those things, I realized I'm one of those statistics, the way they asked the question, because I'm no longer a pastor. When I get in large groups of folks and they ask the pastors to please raise their hand or to please stand, I never do that because I don't pastor a church and preach on Sunday. I still have a role in ministry, but I'm not a pastor. And I really shun the identification of pastor to pastors. So I would be one of the statistics that said, all right, I'm not a pastor today. So I fall into that percentage. And as I was a young pastor, I looked around in my church and I realized I had a lot of folks like that. In the last church that I pastored, I had several folks who were chaplains. We were in a medical university environment there in the Augusta area. And there were several folks who were in our church that were now chaplains at the hospital. But there were some that were school teachers and insurance salesmen and a host of other things. And sometimes we would talk and, ask what was going on. And some of the response was, well, I just wasn't sure that God had really called me into the ministry. Jimmy Draper says, the ministry is a terrible vocation, but a wonderful calling. And as I prepared for this, I thought, what I really would like to do? I would like to sit down with some pastors that are highly regarded, that have spent a lifetime in ministry, and ask them about these 5 areas. And so I did. I had some specific criteria. They had to be 65 or older. They had to have pastored successfully for a long time, not somebody who came into the ministry late and then just happened to retire. So I wanted somebody that had done it for a long time. I wanted somebody that was well regarded as a pastor. someone that we know and we look up to. And I wanted pastors of large churches and small churches. I didn't want to discriminate there. And so I identified a number of folks, and I went and asked them in an interview format. We just talked about these areas. And I said, give me your experience. Tell me what you thought. And one of the things that really surprised me, let me reframe that. One of the things that I noticed, particularly as it dealt with this, was every man, without exception, said their call was crystal clear, and it was never anything that they doubted. John Morgan was one of the pastors that I interviewed. John is the pastor of Sagemont Church. He started that church over 50 years ago. This August, I believe, they will celebrate their 51st year. And his father was a pastor for over 50 years. Here in our city, he was the pastor of First Baptist Church of Pasadena. He helped start this church. And so when John comes to this, he comes with a real clear sense of what it means to be called to the ministry. And I just let him talk a little bit about that.
The most important thing in the ministry is to know that you've been called. I knew that God was calling me into the ministry when I was about 12 or 13 years old, but it wasn't until I was 15 years old that I made a public commitment to say to everyone, I know that God's calling me and I can't do anything else. And I remember what my father said, who was a Southern Baptist pastor for more than 50 years. And he said, son, just make sure that God's calling you, because the day is going to come when that's the only thing that will keep you in the ministry. And I can honestly say that a lot of days have come like that.
And I'm sure there are many who can identify.
So the call means everything. And I'm sad to say that in the fact that now I'm much older and I get the opportunity to talk to a lot of young preachers, that when we start talking about the call, they look at me as though I'm not really sure what you mean by that. But the thing that lifts you when you get discouraged is God's called you.
And as I was reading through the life of Jesus, one of the things that I noticed was at the beginning of his ministry, this was the thing that he nailed down. This whole wilderness temptation experience, going off into the desert, read and understood theologically, it was Jesus nailing down his sense of call and clarifying what kind of Messiah he would be. Was he going to be a miracle-working Messiah? Was he going to be a political Messiah? Was he going to be the kind of Messiah that gave the people what they wanted, whether it was healing or food? Those were the kinds of questions and struggles that he went through. And from a theological standpoint, he was really nailing down and clarifying what it meant for him to follow the will of God. So even Jesus clarified his sense of call. The second area that folks dealt with was this area of conflict in the church. And I'm very fortunate. I was raised in a low conflict family. Not everybody is, but I was. And we got along well. I loved, and to this day, love my brother and sisters. My father is still with us. We'll celebrate his birthday this weekend. So if anybody has tickets to the Super Bowl, don't give them to me. I'm not going. I'm going to be at Dad's, and we're going to celebrate his 89th birthday. So I came from a very loving and supportive family. Not everybody that enters the ministry enters that way. Some come from highly conflicted backgrounds. Alcoholic family backgrounds, abuse backgrounds, and a number of other things, divorce that where there was a lot of fighting in the family going on. And so it's very easy to develop survival strategies to survive that kind of environment. And a lot of times when we come to ministry, we come with poor conflict management skills. And honestly, I went through college, I went through seminary. I don't know, maybe I did, Bob, but I don't know that I ever had a class on managing conflict in the church. I was fortunate when I got out. I was in Nashville. Baptist Sunday School Board, as it was called then, did a lot of training for ministers, and they had sessions on conflict management. So I learned, and honestly, there was a kind of naivete in the ministry. I thought, I love God, they love God, we all read the same Bible, there shouldn't be any conflict in the church. And that's just not true, because we are all fallen people. And we have a lot of opinions. And believe me, this was before the social media age where everybody started sharing their opinions. Then if you had an opinion to share, you went out into the parking lot. That's not true anymore. We share opinions every place. So the whole sense of conflict is extremely escalated. Don't believe it? Look at the political environment. We live in a different world where conflict, everybody's got an opinion, everybody shares their opinion, and so the level of conflict is escalated. Even Jesus had to deal with conflict. Sometimes it was conflicting expectations. Sometimes it was problems with the disciples. Even Jesus had to deal with conflict. And I found it interesting that many, many men have left the ministry because of conflict. I had one fellow who was in my church, and this time he was an insurance salesman. And when we talked about his experience, he told me of the conflict in his church and how out of hand it became and what a difficult life he experienced as a result of it. So much so that he said, if this is what ministry is like, I'm out of here. I can find some other way to serve the Lord. Well, conflict. As I was talking with the 5 pastors that I talked with, I was surprised when I asked them, tell me about conflict in the church. And every one of them gave me the same answer. They said, I served the sweetest church. It just really wasn't a problem for us. Now, I knew better. But that was their perception and that was their memory. I served the sweetest church. We just didn't have conflict. Really? You're John Morgan, you've been in the ministry for 50 years, you've gone from nothing to several things. You've never had conflict in the church? And so I began to probe. And as I probed deeper, what I discovered was there was conflict in the church, all right, especially in the early days, but they managed it in such a way that they created a climate of high trust in their leadership. And as they created this climate of high trust, when trust is high, conflict is down. Bob Overton is here. He's one of the guys I interviewed. And I think he wanted to see what I did with what he said. But Bob told me, he said, we just had the sweetest spirit there at Rice Temple. And they did. But as I probed deeper, he said, well, there was this time where, and I'll summarize the story rather than let him share it on video. There was this time where the church was really divided over a stained glass. And he said, I could see trouble really coming. And he said, as I prepared, he said, when we came together that night, one of the things I said, Bob, I may not get it exactly right, so you can correct me, was I said to the folks, how we do things is as important as what we decide to do. Is that How did you say it?
I said it a little bit more distinct. What we do is not as important
As how we do it. What we do is not as important as how we do it. And he talked about how that meeting went from being potentially very conflicted and divisive in the church to working out really well where they made a unanimous decision. And he said, you know, to this day, even when he goes back to preach after having retired years ago from Rice Temple, he said, people will still talk to me about that moment. And what I discovered was with every one of them, there was one of those moments when they handled conflict well and they began to cultivate a lasting environment and culture of trust. But then I probed Bob a little bit further. And I said, well, weren't there some cantankerous folks that you had to deal with? And, you know, anyone that's been in the ministry a long time knows there are always some cantankerous folks that we have to deal with. And he said, oh, yeah. So I'm going to let Bob give you his answer for dealing with these because it was absolutely beautiful. Listen, there's wisdom here.
I go to the individual. And I can say these things. Sometimes I have to spend a good deal of time in prayer before I can get into the right attitude. I have learned that I better be prayed up when I go into something like that. Because my attitude has to be right, and my attitude has to include a genuine love for this person and an appreciation for them. And I try to ask the Lord, I do ask the Lord to show me the good features about this person. And so I would go to them and I say, I just want to talk to you about this. And I know that you love the Lord as much as I do, that you want to serve the Lord as much as I do. But we've got some different opinion, and I just need to understand where you're coming from because you're seeing things I don't see. Would you help me to see what you see? And they would. And then they'd listen to what I saw. And it never failed that we'd come out of that meeting with I don't think it ever failed. Because people want to be heard. They know that they know some things that are important, but nobody's listening to them. And the truth is, almost every time they know something that if you can include the values or the I don't know, the input of what they're saying, it'll save you a whole lot of trouble down the road. Your whole proposal will be better. Your whole plan will be better if you pick up the wisdom. And sometimes it's crucial information about what's out there that I would have no way of knowing. But this would head off some of that stuff that would come up later. So it was tapping into their wisdom and their knowledge and including that as part of the proposal.
Wow. Valuing that person, listening to that person, trusting that person. You want them to trust you, you've got to trust them. And Bob illustrated that perfectly. Thank you. Over and over again, I heard three things. Preach and teach the word, love the people, trust the people. Key strategies for managing conflict. Well, not only was there conflict in the church, but then there's the personal sense of burnout. 90% of pastors report working between 55 and 75 hours a week, and 50% of them feel unable to meet the demands of the job. And as a result of that, and it's common in healing professions when there is a lot that's expected of us, that it's easy for us to burn out. Now, burnout is a term we ought to understand well here in Houston. We're familiar with rockets and how rockets take off. And a multi-stage rocket takes off, and there's a lot of power and energy stored up in that first stage. But eventually it burns out, and when it burns out, it falls off, and another one takes over. And that's where the term burnout came from. It's that we use up all that energy, and eventually we burn out, and when we burn out, we fall off and fall away. I was surprised when I started checking a couple of weeks ago at the number of websites that are devoted to burnout in the ministry. One of the quotes that I read was this: "We cannot explore all the conditions that confront clergy in their efforts to fulfill their calling. It's important to understand that the work of the minister of today is far more complex and hazardous than it has ever been before, that the expectations of skill and professionalism are more demanding, that the ability to meet the demands that are placed on the minister has probably diminished. In light of the other demands placed by family and society upon them, it's not surprising that ministers burn out. It's surprising that more of them do not do so." And when we burn out, the signs are always there in advance. Irritability, frustration, fatigue, difficulty making decisions. We could probably write our own list. But what it underscores for me is why self-care is so absolutely critical. We have to take care of ourselves in order to avoid the burnout. So that's why the exercise and the rest and the nutrition, those things are so critical. The trouble with self-care is that it often feels selfish. If I'm faced with a choice of going to the gym or going to the hospital, I probably ought to go to the hospital. So I'll value them more than I value myself. But interestingly, as I read through the Gospels and repeatedly read them, what I discovered was there was a rhythm to the ministry of Jesus. He was with the people and he withdrew from the people. He was with the people and he served them. He healed the sick. He cast out demons. He fed the hungry, and then he withdrew. And sometimes he didn't just withdraw with a small support system. Sometimes he withdrew to be completely and totally alone. So the conviction that I came to was, if self-care was that important to Jesus, it's okay for me as well. I mean, who is busier than the President of the United States? And yet, we often heard of President Clinton, President Bush, President Obama, running or taking time to take care of themselves as well. And so we say, well, I'm just too busy to do that. And I'm saying, failure to take care of yourself is failure to take care of your people. Ron Lyles pointed this out so well. Ron is the pastor of South Main Church in Pasadena. Now, Ron is not retired. Like John Morgan, he's still pastoring, but Ron is past retirement age. He won't always say it. And he lives an extremely busy life. In fact, he is a self-confessed workaholic. You know how he spends his day off? He travels down to Corpus Christi and he teaches. That's how he spends his day off. Ron really doesn't take a break. Anyone who's been to the UBA golf tournament knows that he does not play golf. But Ron has a wonderful way of taking care of himself. We addressed the issue of burnout, and I asked him, how do you avoid getting burnt out given the schedule that you keep?
Well, you have to manage it and avoid, I've sought to avoid the burnout thing by keeping battery recharged. And so
how do you keep your battery
for
recharged?
a long time, I arrive at my office at 7 a.m. I don't typically open that door to my office until 11 a.m. And so I have always protected, and I told the congregation early on, and they respect it. I always have protected early morning time for study and devotion and prayer and building that foundation in my own life. It's most of it is not preparation for sermon so much. It is to feed me and to nourish me. And so if I can nourish me consistently, then I will be able to nourish others. And so I've always said to the congregation, you give me this time to work on my relationship to God, and it will ultimately be of benefit to you. And so I don't take calls unless it's some kind of an emergency basis. Sometimes I glance at emails when they come in, sometimes I don't. But my staff knows that I will not immediately reply and carry on exchange of electronic conversation during those hours. And folks who send an email to me, membership, or leave a voicemail for me, know that it'll be returned after 11 o'clock. So I've protected that space and time in order to strengthen that. And again, it's a preemptive kind of thing. In order to keep my own spiritual energy strong, so that I can continue to give emotionally and spiritually and practical help to others.
So, taking care of yourself is a way of taking care of your people. Burnout. We may not all follow the same strategy, but it's important to have a way of managing the stress and strain of ministry. Personal finances. If you want to get rich, don't go into the ministry. 70% of ministers report that they feel not just underpaid, but grossly underpaid. You know, I doubt any of us took a vow of poverty when we went into the ministry, and yet none of us expected to really get rich in doing it. The critical thing I discovered in talking with the pastors that I talked with was that money is important, but it's not a central focus for their life or their decision making. Royce Measures was the pastor for many, many years of Golden Acres in Pasadena. And Royce is a very practical, very straightforward individual, as you'll hear in just a minute. And I heard things in dealing with like salary. I had several who said to me, you know, when I went to that church, I had no idea what I was going to get paid. We never really talked about salary. You know, what I did was I prayed and we determined that it was the Lord's will for me to come. Jimmy Draper in his book says, I didn't even know what I was being paid until a couple of weeks after I had been at the church and I got my first paycheck. Royce had a little bit different approach.
We got down, every issue was resolved except the salary. They had already voted on next year's budget. I looked at that and I said, that's a young man's salary. They said, well, don't you want to pray about it? And I said, no, I'm not even trying to live.
Nothing to pray about. Yeah.
Well, we're not talking about my calling, we're talking about my job.
Yeah.
So we went to Ridgecrest with the WMU ladies, and while I was there, the chairman of the committee called me and said, hey, we've met, we recommended a certain figure, and the church has approved it. Well, of all things, that was a figure I had in my mind that was necessary. Bingo. Oh. So here we are.
Here you are, and here you've been ever since.
I'm kind of like old Jonah. I was going, but I didn't want to.
Yes. Oh, goodness. But Royce had more to say about the issue of money than that. So, listen to what he had to say.
You live on what you make, no matter how much. And my dad helped me at his funeral. He gave, the pastor said, I want to give you a crash course in Measures Economics 101. Talking about my dad. Number one is you know the difference between what you want and what you need. Number two, you live on less than you make. And number three is under no circumstances ever you borrow money. So we've tried to live that way. And we've lived on what we've made. It's been very skimpy at times. When you're making $50 a week with a baby boy, that's pretty hard. And pay the butane bill. And then you move to one that made $70 a week. I was still going to seminary then. And the church on the lake was the first one that paid me an adequate salary.
Yeah. I could just as easily put Dr. Overton's response up. When I asked him that question, he said, well, I learned to be poor. So, but I like what Royce said when he said, you know, you learn to live on what you've got. You don't make that the focus of your ministry. It's about obeying God, not about getting rich, and identifying the difference between want and need. But probably the area where things got most personal was when we moved from personal finances to dealing with family issues. And here's where sometimes the conversation was very obviously painful. There's a lot of pressure on the minister's family. We live in a glass house. Everybody's observing us. There are expectations to have the perfect marriage and the perfect kids, and none of us can live up to that. And as we talked, each one had stories that they shared. And many times those stories got very, very personal, reflected significant pain, sometimes even causing them to doubt whether or not they should have continued in the ministry. As they were going through it, they were wondering, should I even continue given what's going on in my life with my family? All of them did, because I think they learned some lessons along the way. John Bassanio, pastor of Houston's First Baptist for 30 plus years, Brother John talked a little bit about this.
If I were to name the 10 or 20 or 50 best committed Christian families I know, the Caldwells, the Morrises type people, 9 out of 10 of them had a child that went astray. Billy Graham's got a boy named Franklin. Hello.
Yes.
He spent years racing up and down the road to Europe with whiskey and in one hand, a babe in the other. Train up a child the way he should go when he's old, he's old, depart therefrom. I have a theory, I know it's theologically right, but it's my theory. It doesn't say when he's young, it says when he's old. I've said a million times, I do not think the promise is that they won't go away, because in fact they do go away, no matter how good you are. The Billy Grahams of the world, they go away. Well, I had one that went into academia, far country, and one that went into drugs in far country. They're both so on fire for Jesus today and teaching Sunday school and winning the world. I've never known one family that didn't. Very few had one that went away. Some way, some degree, for some time. But I never knew one that didn't come back. Never. They always come back.
He talked a little bit more about his own way of parenting.
Grace and mercy. Grace and mercy. I'm easy on everybody. I'm easy on the kids. I show them a lot of grace and a lot of mercy. Now, when push came to shove, I say, I love it, here's where it's going to be. Okay. But he never, ever say, unless you so-and-so and so, you ain't coming back to this house. Never, never. Always keep the door open. Always keep the arms of love out. Be firm, be loving, but keep the door open. and be gracious, and cut them a lot of slack, give them a lot of room. Let them know the guy that you're negative, worrying, and checking on, you're not going to do as good as you are with the kid that you give some freedom. You say, I love you, I trust you, I believe in you. So that's the way we raise our kids, and they're serving the Lord, they're happy, they love Jesus.
Focus on the relationship. There may be times when it's stressful and strained, but focus on the relationship and do everything you have to do in order to maintain the relationship. Because today is not forever. And it may be tough right now, but that doesn't mean it's going to be this way from now on. So we believe in redemption. Sometimes we need to focus that even on our own families. Through it all, there was one underlying theme that came through in every interview. And that was that these men all possessed a profound trust in God. Now, sometimes it came out in their leadership. And John Morgan told a great story, a story that probably none of us are ever going to tell, about leadership and vision and casting vision and trusting God for resources. And in the most unexpected and remarkable way, $1 million was given to the church. But he kept casting vision and he kept believing God. But sometimes it just comes out in a different way, in what psychologists call grit. The capacity to persevere, to keep going when things are tough, and to go because we believe in God. When I graduated from college, I received a cross pin. It was a silver cross pin, and I kept it for so many years, not because it was a wonderful pin, but because of the note that came with it. And the note said simply this: Tom, I know you believe in God. I hope you will remember that God believes in you. That's why He's called you to the ministry. Wow. Well, these folks really did believe in God. And like Jesus, who experienced his own personal Gethsemane, the thing that kept them going was the sense of not my will, but thine be done. And even though I face a cross, I believe there's something beyond it. Royce expressed that beautifully.
The worst crisis I faced in the ministry was the loss of our son, which had nothing to do with the church family. Mm-hmm. But a 39-year-old son had a heart virus and got sick on Friday and died on Sunday. And he was a deacon at Columbus Avenue and in the handbell choir and taught computer science at Baylor for years. I thought, why in the world did the Lord take somebody that was so useful when he left a bunch of rascals at home? Mm-hmm. That was hard to take. But
tell me about that.
I trusted the Lord. I don't understand it even now. And it does. I asked a lady I had helped bury, had the funeral or graveside service for her son. He was a young man. And Mark was 39, and this young man was probably in his early 30s. And I said, how long does it take before it stops hurting so bad? She said, this has been years. She said, you'll have to ask somebody that knows, because it still hurts. Sure. And it still does. And that was 20 years ago. And I know, yeah, easily. And it's, wife and I cried a lot. And then we began to, as old hymn says, precious memories, how they linger. Mm-hmm. And I said, Lord, I don't understand this, and I'm not questioning your wisdom. Just give me grace to accept it. And he did.
We're familiar with Reinhold Niebuhr's prayer. usually called the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. But you know, that's still a good prayer for all of us. I've spent 46 years in full-time ministry. And I can honestly say, I wouldn't have lived my life any other way. My prayer is for you, for all of those, especially as this new generation of folks rise to take responsibility in leadership, is that they too will figure out what it takes to enjoy a lifetime of leading in ministry.